This is Dave Bunky, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and this is Sunday, December the 3rd, 2017, and this is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's look at the environment, rails, trails, and greenways, and lots of stuff going on in our fair community.
Yes, have a lot to say today. I picked up a card that someone sent to me that said, more or less, I never know what David's job is. Everyone else I know that has a job, I can tell what they do. But David, I just don't understand. So, yeah, we try and look at the environment generally, and so yes, my interests are gregarious, and my involvement in the environment is wide. So how do you deal with that? Perhaps run through some of the things we've done this week. I visited with Carrie, who is one of the vendors at the farmers market. She's she and her daughter Christy sell fruit and vegetables, and they had Levi, a farmer that produces a lot of their goods. He had brought up from Anna, Southern Illinois, a hawk that had somehow broken a wing, and it had survived in his yard, flopping around and picking up food, but it couldn't fly. So they were taking this bird to the veterinary school to see what might be possible. The broken wing probably had healed incorrectly, so it might be that they would have to reset the wing, break it again and reset it, which still might incapacitate the bird. Some of these birds that are injured, they fly into towers and aerial lines and the like. They go to situations like the Nita Purvis Center has a number of creatures that you couldn't responsibly release into the environment, but they can allow people, and children especially, to get some close association with an owl or a hawk or a dove that would otherwise be put down. So that was interesting. I haven't called to find out what the outcome was of taking it to the vet school, but that was a kindly thing to do. And Carrie has to deal with she's got a little farm there on South Ray Street, and she has all sorts of creatures that come in and invade, and sometimes can check out a chicken or take eggs, and so she has to sometimes trap and remove an animal or two. Okay, next thing. This is perpetual. I went to the dumpster, and there's a fairly large office chair in the middle of the dumpster. It took up at least a half of the space of the dumpster, and I keep harping on this. People who use dumpsters need to be kind enough to either take that piece of equipment to Habitat or somewhere, or break it down so it doesn't take up the space in the dumpster. So I picked it up, put it in my CRX, and took it to Habitat. It probably needed some repair. I sat in it, and the seat was a little worn, but quite repairable. Had a bundle of plastic piping that I hauled out of the dumpster. I took it to PACA, the Preservation and Conservation Association, and they looked at it and said, well, some of this is yellow PVC, so that's obsolete anymore because it breaks down after the use. So it's been replaced by this white one. Well, the person I was talking to said, undid this 5-inch piece of equipment, which was not pre-used, it was brand new. He said, $4 for the top, $8 for the piece. And there were other pieces that got saved too. This is not awfully historic material for the Packers warehouse. So sometimes they have to recycle that too, but we don't have a recycling system for hard plastic. So it's better to be used. So they put this on the shelf and hope that the people who come in to acquire materials from Packer will just happen to see that they might use that piece of equipment. So I was pleased that I'd recycled that, and sad that somebody had thrown it out at the dumpster. It's always easier to go and get what you want when you want. Had a bunch of jewelry trays. I don't know where I got them. People bring me stuff, and I just took this box to the idea store, and I'm very used to getting an assessment of whether they want to take this or it's not recyclable. They have a nice little list of things where they've got too much. They have a lot of folders, for instance, as people have been computerizing. They get rid of old folders, and so they get a lot of those. There's just also a list of things that they need, things that would be helpful at this time. I came across a folder of children's art. Gertrude Wiseman, with whom I showed artwork in places like the Art in the Park, had left town. She'd had 3 daughters. And I just looked at this pile of children's pictures. She had hated to throw it out, so I ended up with it. But I thought, this is rather a wonderful artwork, and just the sort of thing you would like to see archived or preserved somewhere. May not be visited for a long time, but it's I'm thinking to photograph some of it and send it to one of the daughters to see if the family would like to go back and look at this folio. Ran across a Natural Area Study Group article, and we had a lot to do with initiating. So the Natural Area Study Group has done very well, and it's done it independently of us, but you have to remember some of the things we initiate go into action, and that usually takes the awareness of where it started away. But that's part of the environmental thing, is you initiate. You don't expect it to be accredited that you've had something to do with starting this, but to initiate in the first place takes time and money and ideas. So I just registered that, but that's part of being an environmentalist, is to initiate and hand over and have other people do things. I ran into someone who is writing poetry, and we've had Ruth Walker on here with poetry that she puts together, local poetry, and so this is a different generation doing something the same, and we may have them on, so one or two poets locally on WEFT. I went to market on the square. It cost me $45 for the booth, that $20 for registration. But I talked to a lot of people, and I think we have to be out there talking about what we do. WEFT has been pretty good at doing this, and when you have a big gestalt, it's hard for people to understand, so you need to be out there, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. I have a niece that's come to Washington, so I've been communicating with her. She's an Australian naval person, and she's a liaison officer to the Pentagon. Which we've had her here. She's been a skydiver, so they are organized enough that they can drop 100 people out in the air, and then they hold hands in a floral arrangement and go down and then release. And it takes a talent to get to do that sort of thing. I just picked up a little package that came to me through WEFT. It was sitting on WEFT desk, picked up because my door was shut, and it's seed from Ron Slater. That it will augment some of our prairie sites with a prairie plant that's not so common. So that's sort of what I was doing this week. Gets to be a full week. But so I thought I'd say something about the definition of what an environmentalist is. You come into a site. In my case, I came from Australia and was looking for the ecosystem, and I couldn't find it. So you get involved. first of all, you're an outsider coming in, so sometimes you see things differently, but you also are embarrassed to say anything because it's not your territory to do that. But gradually I got to the point where I saw young people sitting in the middle of poison ivy and a few other things and not knowing what their ecosystem was. So I started to get involved and have been so involved for many years. But it is a gestalt. It's like Arlene Ansbach said when she was writing a little note to say she didn't know what David did as a job. I'd photographed a kimono for her. She was a fashion professor, and she had a background in Iowa where they had mineral springs, they had mining. Her family was a family of doctors, and they had hotels that were associated with the springs, and they even had railroad accessibility that was special for people coming in from Chicago and other places. She had farmland, and she knew that I would encourage her to do no-till, and so there was a science background there. There was an art background. There was an educational component. So she was really a little confused as to what was my real job. So some of it is to do something like buy railroad beds when they are being abandoned. They won't be there ever again. And so you have to develop enough sophistication in your gestalt to be able to say, we'll do that. And you have to convince people to help pay for that. We did that in the Monticello area, and I'm rather pleased we did it. It is also rather complex. It's 3 separate entities, 3 separate rail beds on either end of the Railroad Museum. So the Railroad Museum bought some of the same Illinois Central and Gulf railroad bed, but they kept the rail on it, and they bought it with rail. We bought without rail, but we have the capacity to re-rail 4 miles of it with the hope that we might get historic trains into Champaign at one stage. It might be a long, slow process, but you have to be dreaming to do that. You have to work with railroad engineers who will have that sort of interest. You have to know that they're interested in railroads rather than with the prairie that's on either side of the bed. So you get to be on their board, which is the Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad, historic railroad. And we're starting to re-rail that 4 miles. It's a hope that there's another probably 8 miles between Seymour and Bonneville and Duncan Road that will be abandoned. Also, if we're not very careful, we'll lose that line that has rail on it. So we're working with federal and state people to see if we cannot buy, borrow, beg, or steal that few miles of railroad bed and connect it to what we're re-railing, so that we can have a little realization of the railroad transportation that made this country accessible. Many modern-day people have never ridden on a train. In some cases, the trains have been upgraded to the point that they can go 250 miles an hour, and that has an ability to compete with airlines. So you have to think about infrastructures and how you work and what do you do with history, and do you continue to carry grain from two elevators? So we gathered up that 33 miles, and then you don't always know what to do with it. How do you? Well, you know that you wanted to preserve the prairie that was on either side of the ballast, so that remains. That's the highest and best use as far as we're concerned. As far as the farmers on either side are concerned, that's not necessarily the highest and best use for them. The highest and best use is corn and soybeans. So we're in competition to some extent, but we've managed to keep the nature relatively undisturbed. In the railroad bed is about 100 feet wide, and the ballast itself is probably 15 to 25 feet at most, and the rest is relatively undisturbed as long as there's no encroachment. So you have to dream about this. If you're going to put in a trail, you have the choice of going with a trail that's rather native. And these railroad beds, when they were active, people used to walk down the railroad bed with the railroad on it. They had to avoid a train here and there, but they could cross the bridges and the trestles. And with our purchase of that 33 miles, we got 3 truss bridges and 27 trestles. So how do you protect them, and how do you use them, and how do you convince the public to use them for a different purpose, which is genetic, the gene pool, rather than for more crops? And even the trails don't have to be trails. They are often used locally by people who sometimes do a little bit abusing with motorcycles, but they're basically using the corridors, and even farmers right adjacent will often use that railroad bed with a local trail. Well, if you go officially at a state and federal level, those trails become very formal. They can be very straight instead of wiggly-woggly, and they can take out all the habitat on either side of the line. So you have to dream about how you do something. You don't have the money. Like the Kickapoo Trail is budgeted with about $12 million, so we don't have that sort of money. And so this 33 miles has been sitting for quite some time. Monticello City has put in a 2-mile trail. It's called the Sangamon Bridge Trail, and it goes across the Sangamon River, and it is more or less a bridge on top of a bridge and bridge on top of a trestle. So as carpentry has been done in such a way that there is a fence on either side of the bridge, and it's a very popular trail. So that piece is in action. Some of the prairie between Monticello and Cisco has been sitting, and it's doing very well. It's a remnant prairie. It's not reconstruction prairie. So even though it's been sitting for 30 years, it's there. And it could be developed. It is suffering from the invasive weed trees known as a autumn olive, which were brought in by Department of Conservation as a bird strip, and certainly the birds moved the idea around, and they become a state and a regional weed tree. So that takes out some of the prairie, but if you remove it by chainsaws and herbicide the stem, the prairie plants amazingly will come through. If you leave it too long, they will. Some of the more refined plants will disappear. But we have that 4 miles, and it's that when you look at the gestalt that people don't understand, then you can pick off little pieces. So we're at the point where we pick off a piece like that and suggest that it could go as a natural area. Then you have to consider whether you put a trail through on the ballast. Is that trail going to be a narrow trail, 2 feet wide, because the prairie has encroached onto the ballast? Or are you going to have a 12-foot or a 14-foot trail that will take out the prairie on the ballast and around the ballast? So you then have to try to let people know what you have, and that can cost money. You have to have brochures. You have to have brochures that are 1 page, brochures that are 25 pages for planners and people who might like to be involved. And you have to have a fairly specific plan that might be 40 pages for people who might be interested in engineering. And then you have to know who's going to own this in the future. What is an easement? Can you provide an easement? And that means legal work. You have to have perhaps a 20-page document that says that Heartland Pathways owns the land, but the prairie on it or the railroad on it may be an easement run by a different organization. So you also are somewhat dependent on other things happening. So we had a lot to do with initiating the Kickapoo Trail, because there was a Rail Banking Act which helped to preserve the bridges and the titles and made one more public use of the corridor and provided some money for the support of that. Now, 7 miles of that is in action, and it's being very well used. It's a little wider than we had hoped and takes out some of the remnant prairie that was there. So the next time around, we're hoping that the trail will be a little narrower and preserve some of the habitat. So that, however, the success of that trail and the success of the trail at Monticello are two prototypes in this region that allow us to get some, give people some idea of what they can have or what they're missing. The rest of the country has about 20,000 miles of these rail beds where the railroaders preserved the bed by having deal with bicyclists and hikers to save those corridors, and they provide money for their development. It's called enhancement money, and that's much cheaper than trying to buy back real estate in 50 years' time. Many of these trails are not going to go back to main lines. They've been small elevator lines, and with elevators about 5 miles apart. And these small elevators have small lines, so you can only have a few trucks, like 14 or 15 trucks, line up, which is not very helpful for the railroads. They would like to have a super elevator, so just west of Champaign we have a Cargill's elevator with 2 and 3 spur lines in, and you can load up a 125-car train. So that's obsoleted many of the little wooden elevators that were. So you're looking at changes in technology, changes in legality, changes in popularity, alternate forms of interest, and how do we do it with no money to do it? Because we bought our 33 miles of railroad bed before there was a Rail Banking Act that made a deal with bicyclists to do an interim trail use. But the Kickapoo Trail that's in action now helps us a lot. So with the help of WEFT and with the help of Urbana Public Television, we put a lot of this information up, firstly on radio, especially with Bill Saylor. It goes back some 30 years. Some of it's a little repetitive in purpose, because it's what we're talking about is fairly hard to understand. You have to simplify it, and David has been very helpful in putting visuals into this. Much of what we do is visual oriented. You get the message that we're doing the best we can, but we're not exactly outrageous and speakers. So we attend meetings, we go places, but you have to have a very quick mind. So when people are expecting a 3-line speech, and you have a 10-page mind, then you have to be quick on your feet to try and give an idea what you're doing. So you hear me this morning listening to some of the local things we're doing. Well, when we put that up on public television with pictures in it, so we've gone from a radio program to a television program, and we put it on YouTube, then people can get it. But then you have to realize that there's millions and millions of YouTube statements out there, and this is not really available to everyone. And no one's going to go read 175 one-hour YouTube programs. So you have to break it down. You have to take the pieces out that are oriented to, say, Heartland Pathways, and put that as a link so that you can send that to people. Then there's a whole process of sending. How do you send the link? How do you have a brochure? Brochures get to be very expensive. When you want to mail them, that is expensive too. How do you do this without much money? WEF does very well with their attempts to do that without a lot of money. And just this last week, they got some feedback and a small grant. And so it's just, you have to keep working at it, and you have to explain to people what it is that you're doing and why. It's a very good radio station with people who are volunteers who have a really nice knowledge of music. So how do you convince your music population to support that? And in the counterpart with Heartland Pathways, how do you explain that you have 3 separate railroad beds on the end of on 2 ends of a railroad museum that has potential? You're taking perhaps a train or hikers and bikers down to a historic picnic ground called Shady Rest. It's on the banks of the Sangamon River. People get to try to preserve the dignity of the riparian rivers, the adjacent lowlands, and there are moraines involved, which give some interesting landscape. So how do we list these things? So this week I've been talking to Deanna Glosser, who's a CEO for Bruce Hannon's trust, land trust. And how do you work with this? Do you go out with your gestalt and well, first of all, we think not. Firstly, in our case, the mother company to Heartland Pathways was Educational Resources and Environmental Science. So you keep thinking that we've been doing things there, so you want to report to your supporters what you're doing. And that gets to be even more complex than just the Heartland Pathway. So can you simplify it by separating out the child from the adult, and so Heartland Pathways can stand on its own legs, I believe, and so do others believe, and it's done enough on its own right. So we now need to have brochures and computer context and supporters that know that this is Heartland Pathways. Then within Heartland Pathways, you look for little pieces like Shady Rest, which is a picnic ground of 30 acres, and can that go into the Piatt County Forest Preserve? And that has happened, and so that's a little piece. The 2 miles of trail that the Monticello has put in, that's another piece that's worked. The preservation of the corridor that goes through to past Allerton Park is rather wonderful in my mind. It's not the world's greatest prairie, but it's all we have, and it has a road alongside it which has been replaced by an interstate that takes most of the traffic. So you could have a shared road. That would mean we don't have to have a trail on the prairie that is expanding itself. So is this a target that we could look at? And we think that is a possibility. So you take your gestalt of complex and reduce it to a portion. Then we have to seek the money to do simple things. This is a trail that was purchased before a Rail Banking Act, so there's not $12 million towards putting in a trail, and the trail is not exactly what we're wanting. The main aim was to do prairie preservation. So this week I had to decide whether to go to the indoor farmers market. And I think it was very worthwhile going. This is a end of the year season, and I took T-shirts. I only sold one T-shirt, but I spent a lot of time talking to people, and so you hear my voice is a little gone at the moment. But I was rather pleased to be there. There was a cost. How do you cover that cost? So you have to sometimes be bold enough to have your hand out to see if you can get funds. We badly need a 2-page brochure. Many people, I spread out a map of Heartland Pathways on the floor and put another visual that was rather large to show what a roadside prairie, a railroad side prairie was like. And people at this time of the year are thinking to buy a few gifts, but they're mainly looking around. The next 2 or 3 events will be different. And I wasn't really there to sell things. I was selling ideas. And this is a part of the public service part of farmers market or the indoor farmers market. It's like 5 hours and you're standing on your feet for 5 hours because you have a fairly small booth and you need to talk to people, so you don't sort of sit around and wait for people to come to you. You sometimes have to be bold enough to go out to them. So I nearly made it. I put together a Heartland Pathways summary. It's running to about 10 pages. That's without pictures, and we need the pictures. Come Saturday night, I almost made it to having a brochure that you could print on your own computer, and at least key people would who would like to help with politics, would like to help with doing this. So I thought that was very productive, even if I didn't get to take a brochure. But I had cards to show it that gave us contacts, and people know us well enough that they come up to you and talk and are interested. So I think we really have to have our heads hanging out at these sorts of situations. Part of it has to do with how genuine you are. The WEFT has been together for 35 years, and there's a sort of genuineness about that. It's not something that happened yesterday. And Heartland Pathways has been together for similar 30 years. And so this is for real. It's not your casual. Sometimes it can be invaded. We're losing 30 miles of really nice prairie preservation corridor in the Arcola area. It went to formerly to the Department of Natural Resources, but without adequate political support, that's going back to farmers for more corn and soybeans. So we lose a lot of that last 0.01% of remnant prairie that we've saved. And this is not the world's best prairie, but it's all we have. And so there are some people who are quite convinced that that should happen. There are other people who want to put in little prairies around town. They're in their backyard. They can handle them. And we have to give credit to the little prairie across the road, the pocket prairie. It's done a lot of work to introduce people to prairie plants, and where we wouldn't have time or the energy to take people to 30 miles away or 20 miles away to see a nice remnant prairie. It's in jeopardy because the building next door has not rented for a long time, and there's a thought that the pocket prairie could be a bandstand and a place to put restaurant tables and things like that. So we may lose the little prairie, but over 30 years it has helped the world at large to know a little bit more about their heritage ecosystem. So I think we have to get a brochure. We have to get a brochure out fairly soon, and we have to have several types. One is the 2-pager, one is the 30-pager, and one is the technical 40 pages or something like that, or a legal document. There's technology in here. You can't, for instance, re-rail a corridor without knowing something about railroading. So that we've been talking this week about the possibility of spinning off pieces of natural area and also letting people know what we do. And so I've said quite a few things here. This week was full of that sort of thing. We have a question about what is the role of women, and that is again a huge gestalt. We have to look at the biodiversity of our universe, and as humans we're a part of that universe, and we're losing our ecosystems at a very rapid rate. Not only losing our ecosystem, we're losing all the individuals that are in the ecosystem. So I sat down and wrote some notes about this. It's not I'm not an expert in this field, but we have to look on various creatures in the universe that have evolved in certain ways. And you have male and female dominance. You have certain roles to play, and those have changed in years. There's recent reports that women in past eons have had very much bigger bones, partially because they were nomads and they had to scratch in the soil to find the tubers and things that they would eat. They were very much a part of the overall landscape, and their muscles, in order to work, have to have a larger bone. And so those females were also, the other element was males that were hunting, and that hunting was also a muscular thing. And so as we evolve, we change. And in past eras, it was thought that evolution was very, very slow, but it can sometimes be quite fast. And looking at our overall population of males and females, we're getting to have gone through a phase of putting a fence around our property. And the Indians, when the Quakers came to the shores of the U.S., the Quakers were business people. They wanted the trees for things like shipping towers, and they weren't going to worry too much about the ecosystem or the Indians. So you put a fence around it, and then so the role of the male and the female changes some. And over the years, we've had colonialism, where a certain proportion of the people decide that they can utilize the resources in other countries, and then you have the churches get involved, and the churches encourage sometimes population increases beyond what you would expect, where farmers in India or other places need the number of children that will help to provide services. And men and women are very different in different places. So how do we, just as we have to try and define what the environment is, we have to decide what the human environment is. So if you have grown up on farmland and know how animals are attracted by characteristics. We used to have birds of paradise, which have like 6 and 8 foot long feathers that are attractive for females that want to see the manner in which the males can behave, and is that a genetic thing that they would want to encourage? We have our own birds that often are doing dances that are basically an attempt to convince a female that they're worthy citizens. Woodcocks do a fine dance in this respect and don't always win. We have a bowerbird that sets out a bowerbird and puts purple and blue glass and other things that collects flowers, lupins and things in it, and then it does a fine dance and has adjudicated by a female population. So, what are we expecting of women now? As a question. We've gone from an era, the Victorian era, where you could have 10 and 15 and children, and they were part of your workforce. But it got to be that medicine came in and all those people survived, and they had a similar number of children. So you have a population in the world that is far greater than the balance that you would expect if you were sitting up there and deciding how the various ecosystems balanced. There's always competition, there's always involvement from many different directions, but we're changing. If you have one child and you have a lot of potential technology which allows you to bring up a child in a very advantageous fashion, then you also have time to think in other dimensions than just being pregnant for 15 years. You're looking at a different population. So how do we, with good manners, reduce that sort of testosterone that is evolved naturally to an involvement? We're aware that women have a very interesting minds, and their minds are often much different from a male mind. So they may be more gestalt than linear. It may be not that case, but how can we encourage women to be involved in political situations, in financial situations, where they can really contribute without being regarded as sexual objects? But on the other hand, you want these people to get together. So I have to deal with people who are populations of people who are very huggy populations, and sometimes you have people that are not so huggy. So how do you balance these things out, and how do you find that you have women on your team and who are getting more and more adapted to doing teamwork, and how do they have a twinkle in their eye that if you actually make something and it works, then can you hug each other? And that's so there are people who are who married because they're in that sort of a situation where they're enjoying each other's differences and contributions, and we make it. So I'm not very good at this sort of situation, but I think that we need to do a lot more thinking about who women are, who men are. Women have made a lot of progress in 30, 40, 50 years. It's amazing that only in 1923 or something like that we didn't have a vote for women. But men have not had the chance to come quite so far. I think we need women's studies groups that will look at the differences and try to figure out how we can get together in an interesting and exciting manner.
2 minutes.
Oh.
Yes, is that time already?
So we have just a couple of minutes left. I wanted to tie that into the environmental situation. If we have something of the same problem of not always knowing the details of what we're talking about. At the moment, we're about to lose territory in the Bears natural area in Utah, and not everyone knows very much about that. So as environmentalists, we keep poking along and doing what we can, and we'd love to have your support, and please keep listening. And this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.